Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Safranski, and welcome to Session 7 of the Bible and the Eucharist. Now, today we're finally getting to the New Testament, and we're going to be talking about bread, wine, and wheat in the Gospel accounts. So I'm going to be doing two things. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of historical transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, basically just a few big things that are really important for understanding Israel and sacrifice and some of the implications for what Jesus does in the Gospels. Not a whole lot. And then after that, I'm going to look at just a few important mentions of food and food sacrifice in the Gospels that I think sometimes we miss and that fit into the themes we've talked about with the Old Testament and that have implications for our understanding of the Eucharist. I'll be saving a few really important ones for later, especially the Last Supper, which is getting its own whole video, and the Bread of Life discourse, which is going in a video on the Gospel of John. So let's start by talking a little bit about history. In the last episode, I talked about the temple and the importance of God's presence with the Ark of the Covenant in the center of the temple, in the Holy of Holies. Now, the time of the temple, the heyday of the temple, starting in roughly 1000 BC, 900 to 1000 BC, is, in a way, it's the heyday of Israel and the heyday of the people's belief that God was fulfilling his promises to them, the promises that he had made in Genesis 12. Now, that belief starts to face some challenges, some real challenges in the 8th century BC, when God's faithfulness to the promise to give them the land starts to come into some question, right? So in the 8th century is the first time that a foreign invader takes over a large part of Canaan or Israel of the Promised Land. That was the Assyrians. Now, what the Assyrians do is they basically take over the northern part of the Promised Land, but they do not take over Jerusalem and they do not destroy the temple. That's important because as long as the people of Israel still have the temple and they have the Ark of the Covenant, then it's easier for them to believe that God is with them and is present with them. Now, things become even more problematic in the 6th century BC, when the Babylonian Empire basically takes over the Assyrian Empire, conquers more of the Promised Land, and destroys the Temple of Solomon. Now, it's at this time that the actual Ark of the Covenant is lost to history, and in all likelihood, it was taken back to Babylon and destroyed, melted down for gold and whatever other, precious materials they could get out of it. So there's a period of time in there that will always be important to the Jews to look back on that we call the Babylonian exile. This is a period of about 70 years in the 6th century when the Israelites are completely dominated by the Babylonians. They have no temple and they have no ark. Now, it doesn't last forever. Eventually, the Persians take over for the Babylonians, and the Persians have a little bit of a gentler idea about how to rule than the Babylonians did. So they end up not only sending a lot of the Israelites back to Israel and to Jerusalem, the Persians actually encourage the Israelites to rebuild their temple and give them materials to do it. So in the 6th, 5th centuries BC, the Israelites rebuild the temple. Now, according to all accounts, the way they rebuild it is not as grand or as large or as, luxurious as the first temple was. And very, very crucially, they have no Ark of the Covenant. However, despite having no Ark of the Covenant, they believe so profoundly in the persistence of God's presence with them that when they rebuild the temple, they revere the Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the temple, as the location of God's presence in almost the same way as they did when Solomon's temple contained the ark. So they have no Ark of the Covenant. They do have their temple back. They're able to resume sacrifices, right? The sacrifices that God has commanded them to make. They're able to worship there, and they believe that God is present there with them. Now, they're taken over again by the Greeks, or what we might call the Greeks, but essentially the successors of Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BC. You guys gotta believe me, I'm a major history nerd, and I would love, this feels like I'm just flying over this history. I would love to talk about it so much more. The Greeks take over, they rule the land of Israel. In the 2nd century BC, you have the last period of Israelite self-rule under the Maccabees, or what's really called the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Hasmonean kings. You can read about this in 1st and 2nd books of Maccabees in the scriptures. And that is a really important time in the memory of the Jews, because when Jesus comes, it's the last time they really ruled their own land, at least part of it. They didn't rule all of the historical promised land, but they did rule Judea, the area around Jerusalem. Now that came to an end essentially when the Jews made a treaty with Rome, which is also preserved in the books of Maccabees. They made a treaty with Rome to protect them because they knew, well, they thought that they would not be able to defend themselves against invading powers. And they thought that if Rome decided to come after them and take the land, that Rome would be able to do it. So they made a kind of protection treaty with the Romans in the 1st century BC. Now, as often happened with the Romans, what started out as protection treaty kind of slowly became more of an arrangement of, master-servant, or, dominating kingdom and client kingdom, which is the situation when we get to the Gospels. The Romans are the rulers of the area that we would call the Holy Land, or the Promised Land. But there's this tension. See, they allow the Jews to maintain a certain amount of self-government, which is why you have in the Gospels the client king, Herod, who is Jewish, but is essentially a collaborator or a puppet with the Romans, very much like the Vichy government in France during World War II. And the people are divided. What are they divided over? Well, one of the major things that they're divided over is whether they can continue to live under the Romans and without their own sort of total self-rule of the land. Why? Well, it goes back to the promises, right? The promises in Genesis 12 that, remember there were the three promises: the nation, the land, and the blessing. Now, the nation wasn't a problem. They were very numerous. The Israelites were. The blessing, they saw in a few different ways. They saw partly as taking the commandments to the world, which I mentioned before, but they also thought about the blessing as the future coming of the Messiah, who would bring God's rule to the whole world. But the land was a big question, because they believed that God wanted them to possess that land fully and wholly for all eternity. And yet when they're under the domination of foreign powers, it doesn't look like that promise is being fulfilled. Okay? So that's kind of the situation when Jesus comes. The people of Israel have their temple. They have as I mentioned, the second temple. They're able to worship there and offer sacrifice, which is good, but they're divided about the role of the Romans and whether they should continue allowing the Romans to rule them, or whether they should try to throw off the Romans in sort of a military or violent revolution, right? So that brings us to the gospel stories that I want to talk about today, and on this first day where we'll be talking about the New Testament. What do I really want to do today? Well, what I want to do is I want to talk just a little bit about the communities that produce the Gospels, so we get a little bit of context for understanding what the Gospels and the stories in the Gospels really meant to the people who first heard them and the people who first read them. And then I want to talk about a few kind of key stories, and we're going to be sticking mostly with the Gospel of Matthew for the sake of consistency. A few key stories about food, and especially about foods that are related to sacrifice. Okay? So as a reminder, we are still talking about a society that is very different from our own. This is an agrarian society, pre-modern society, that lives in an area of the world that is essentially desert, right? And because of that, food and crops and grain have an importance that we just find it really, really hard to get our heads around, okay? So that when Jesus talks about grain, or he talks about a harvest, or he talks about grapes and whether a vineyard is producing fruit, these are things that for the original hearers of Jesus preaching would have been familiar kind of life and death themes, right? This was a society where a failed harvest or a vineyard failing to produce crops could have literally led to death by starvation, and also could have led to a lack of things to offer to God in sacrifice. Okay? Because this is the second thing about this world that we need to understand the importance of these stories, is that the daily staple foods that we're talking about were also sacrificial. So that every time Jesus talks about grain, or he talks about bread, or he talks about grapes or wine, that carries kind of more than one level of meaning. It carries the meaning of related to the basic needs of life and the people being able to feed themselves and feed their families. But it also has a veil of sacrifice and worship around it, because grain, bread, and wine are three of the primary categories of food that are offered in sacrifice to God at the temple. So let's talk a little bit about, again, just really briefly about the communities that produce the Gospels. When we hear the Gospel stories, I think our instinct, and this is a good instinct, but our first instinct is to think about what it would have been like to be one of Jesus' original disciples, one of the people who heard him speak these words that are in the Gospels, or saw him perform a miracle or some other, one of his signs, one of his actions that he performs in the Gospel. And that's a very good way to think about the Gospels, but it's only one level of meaning that is present in the Gospels. Another major level of meaning that we want to think about is the level that exists for the original Christian communities after the ascension of Jesus and after Pentecost, who wrote these stories down, who told these stories to each other, and who heard them read in their liturgy. One of the things about the Gospels that we know, right? We know that there are 4 different canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them is written by a different author. And in each of them, the author selects certain stories to tell, tells them in certain order, and can kind of paint the drama in different ways, right? So that the impression we can get if we read the 4 Gospels is sort of like, not 4 different, not stories about 4 different Jesuses, because there's only one Jesus, but maybe like 4 different angles on the one Jesus, right? In the way that with any person, any historical figure, 4 different people would give 4 different perspectives on their life, right? So one of the things we want to think about is, for each of those gospel writers, why did the Spirit move that gospel writer to select this story and not another to put in his gospel? Why did the Spirit move him to position the story this way, or to include these details when another gospel writer doesn't include those details, right? So I'll be talking about that a little bit again at the end of our look at these gospel stories, because one of the major points that I want us to take away is the fact that the original communities that were reading and hearing these gospel stories were communities living, again, after the ascension, after Pentecost. And so they are communities whose lives are actually focused around the Eucharist. So the original readers and hearers of these stories are not people who are clueless about the Eucharist. They are people who already know that Jesus has founded his church and has told them to orient their worship and their community around the celebration of the Eucharist, so that things that appear in these stories as hints or echoes of the Eucharist were not accidental. They are not just things that we can read backwards into the Gospels. They are things that the original communities would have seen and would have understood. Okay? And I'll revisit that for just a moment at the end. So we're going to talk about 3 stories from the Gospels today. The first one actually isn't a story so much, it's a prayer. The first passage that I want to talk about is the Our Father from Matthew chapter 6, also seen in Luke chapter 11. As I mentioned, I'm going to be talking kind of specifically about the passages from Matthew for a little bit of consistency. So, in Matthew chapter 6, the disciples ask Jesus how to pray, right? And what does he give them? He gives them the Our Father. That makes this a privileged prayer for all Christians because it is the prayer that Jesus taught us word for word. And the Our Father is traditionally divided up according to the petitions that we ask for in the prayer, right? So we address God, our Father, who art in heaven, and then the first petition, hallowed be thy name, right? And there's all these petitions. So one of those petitions is, give us this day our daily bread, right? Does this remind you of anything? If you've been watching these videos, if you watched my video on the manna in the desert, this absolutely should remind you of that discussion. Remember that when the people were given the manna in the desert, God told them that they were only allowed to gather enough to eat for one day at a time, right? Except for on Friday, they were to gather enough to eat on Friday and on Saturday because they weren't allowed to gather on the Sabbath. And we asked the question of why they would only be allowed to gather one day's worth of bread. We looked back at a very important psalm for understanding that passage, where the psalmist asks God, give me neither riches nor poverty, right? Lest in my riches I forget you, or in my poverty I dishonor you. So as soon as Jesus tells his disciples to pray, give us this day our daily bread, he is calling them back to the time in the desert. He's calling them back to an acknowledgement that everything they need each day comes ultimately from God. He's asking them never to forget that and to continue to pray for that. This also takes his hearers and us back to the heart of sacrifice, a theme we talked about a lot in the Old Testament. Because a major part of sacrifice is offering a little bit of what God gives us back to him as an acknowledgement that he has given us what we need, and as a display of faith, that if we give a little bit back to him instead of hoarding it, that he will give us enough for the next day, right? So this also ties the prayer of Christians into so many of those themes we talked about and those stories we talked about in the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus' original interlocutors are Jews who are extremely familiar with the Old Testament and the Old Testament stories. Those stories are living stories for them. And so when he says, give us this day our daily bread, that sends them back to the manna. It sends them back to thoughts of the bread sacrifice and the cereal offerings that are made in the temple. It sends them back to thoughts of the showbread, like we talked about from the temple. And it sends them back to thoughts of the Passover, right? And it kind of ties all of those things together, all of those themes together. So that whenever we as Christians ask God to give us what we need this day, we are also asking him to give us what we need to offer sacrifice to him. Okay? It's not just about what we need to eat. It's about what we need in order to acknowledge him as our Lord. Now, next I want to talk about the parable of the weeds. And this is in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. And I'll read just the start of it. In verses 24 to 26, we read this. Another parable he put before them, saying, The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also." Unquote. All right, so then the servants of this master, they ask him, now that they've discovered that there are weeds there, they ask him if they should try to pull the weeds out, right? Which to us probably seems like a good idea on its face. If you've got a crop that's starting to grow and you see that there are weeds, maybe you'd want to get the weeds out before they grow any bigger, right? If you have any kind of gardening experience, you know that it's a heck of a lot easier to pull weeds when they're small than when they're huge. Their roots get deeper, they get more intertwined with the plants you want to keep. So it seems like a good idea on its face, maybe. But the master says this in verse 30, quote, "Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Unquote. Now, this is one of those great parables where Jesus does not exactly give a direct explanation of what he means. And so this story, it can be interpreted in a few different ways. One of the traditional ways of understanding this is to think about how within each one of us there are good and bad aspects, right? So that my heart, as a Christian, but as a sinful person, produces both wheat and weeds. And maybe it's a little bit of comfort to think that God is not going to reject the good that I produce because of the bad. That maybe in the end, he's going to harvest it all and get rid of the bad. I like that thought. But another very important way to interpret this passage is to think about the weeds and the wheat as bad and good actors within the world or within the church. So one of the ways that as Christians we read this story is as a way of kind of understanding the fact that as long as we are on earth, that not everyone in the church is going to be a saint, and that definitely not everyone in the world is going to be a saint. The kind of the good and the bad are going to exist side by side, that God is not going to just strike down the evil, tomorrow, that he's going to allow them to grow together, and that in the end, justice will be done. So if that's the case, and that's one of the main ways that we interpret this story, then the good in the church, or those who are in some way truly the children of God, those who are living faithfully according to the gospel, what are they? They are the wheat. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, this symbolism is never accidental, and it's never going to be lost on Jesus' original hearers and the original readers of the Gospels, even if it's lost on us. The people who read these stories originally, and in fact, the people who wrote these stories, they knew all the sacrificial implications of calling us the wheat. And I say us, don't take that as a sign of pride, right? I don't know whether I'm wheat or a weed until the end. I pray to God that he finds me wheat and not weed. I guess I'm just saying us as a kind of shorthand. So they know that if we are the wheat, then that's not an accident. First of all, because they're familiar with the offerings of grain that are made in the temple, what we call cereal offerings, right? So grain is offered as part of the sacrifice to God. Now, grain is also needed to make bread, which is another part of the sacrifice that is made in the temple, right? The showbread and other cake offerings and things. So then the question is, how do you know if you're wheat, or how do you become wheat rather than a weed? Well, as will be sort of developed in the whole preaching of the gospel, you follow the teachings of Jesus, which lead you to living a good life, a life of love of God and neighbor, of proper worship and proper moral action, right? And as we're going to see later, as we're going to continue to see, one of the things that Jesus commands his followers to do is to continue to eat the bread that he gives, the bread that he gives at the Last Supper and at the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. And we'll get to that next week. So by eating the bread that Jesus will give us, we become that bread. And by doing that, we become Christ's body. We'll get into all of that later. But it all kind of works in a, I don't want to say circular pattern, but it's self-reinforcing for both the original hearers and for us to hear a parable like this and think, okay, it reinforces the different aspects of the Christian life for them and for us to know that we're living a life that is centered around the bread and wine that Jesus gave, right? The body and blood, the bread, and to know that we're living a life that's centered around what he gave, and to also hear a story that encourages us to become the wheat that is made into the bread that is offered in sacrifice. Okay? It all kind of, it reinforces the importance of the bread stories and the Last Supper. All right? So the last story I want to look at moves on from grain and bread to grapes, because grapes, and specifically wine, are another central part of sacrifice in the temple, as well as sacred meals, and of course the Eucharist. So we get to this story in Matthew chapter 21 that's often called the parable of the vineyard, or the story of the tenants in the vineyard. Now at this point, towards the end of Matthew's gospel, we're getting closer to the hour of Jesus' glory. We're getting closer to his crucifixion. And so he is more directly confronting the Jewish leaders and speaking to them in a way that he maybe wouldn't have done 10 chapters ago, 15 chapters ago. So the story starts like this in chapter 21, verse 33. Quote, "There was a householder who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it and dug a wine press in it and built a tower and let it out to tenants and went into another country." Unquote. Now, those tenant farmers, they don't send the landowner or the householder, they don't send him any of the produce of the vineyard. They just keep it selfishly for themselves. So he starts to send messengers that they abuse and they kick out of the vineyard, until eventually he sends his son, whom the tenant farmers kill, in the hopes that they will then be able to steal the inheritance of the son. So Jesus asks starting in verse 40, quote, "When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons." Unquote. So one big question about this parable, and it's a question that Jesus is going to answer in a couple verses, is what is the vineyard? Right? What is the vineyard supposed to be? Who are the tenant farmers? And therefore, what is the fruit that is supposed to be produced from the vineyard in this parable? Now, the original hearers, they understood it because it made them really mad, right? He was speaking to the leaders of the Jewish people at that time and telling them that they were the tenant farmers, right? What does that make the vineyard? That makes the vineyard the kingdom of God, or the assembly of God's people, right? So the leaders of the Jewish people are supposed to be the ones who watch over the assembly on behalf of God and offer back to God the fruit that he desires. right? He wants the vineyard, as any like landowner or, vineyard owner would. He wants it to bear good fruit, and to bear good fruit for himself and for the world outside of the vineyard. Grapes do not exist for the sake of the vineyard itself, and they do not exist for the sake just of the tenant farmers, but for the sake of the landowner who wants to profit by that, and for the sake of the wider world, right? You hope that if you own land where you're trying to grow something, that you're going to be able to produce a crop, a product that the world needs, right? So in the vineyard, the grapes are what? They're the people of God. This is another parable where the crop that makes up food, which is both a staple food and a sacrificial food, is essentially analogized to be us, the people of God, right? Just as the wheat in the story of the wheat and the weeds can be seen as the people of God, so the grapes in the vineyard can be seen as the people of God. What does that mean? That means that Jesus is telling us that we are to be made into something that feeds the world, that also gives joy to the world, as the psalm says, wine cheereth the heart of man, and something that is offered back to him in sacrifice, right? And as I mentioned with the parable of the wheat and the weeds, because the original community that read and heard this story and that knew this story, because they know, in a sense, the ending, right? Because they know that Christ is going to command them to live a life centered around the Eucharistic sacrifice of bread and wine, then the stories of grains and bread and grapes echo with them and tie it into a sort of comprehensive picture about what Christ is bringing. Okay? It echoes for them the stories of the manna in the desert. It echoes for them the stories of, not just the stories, but it echoes for them the wine sacrifices that are poured out in the temple. It echoes for them the cups of wine that are drunk as part of the sacred meal of the Passover. And even though we haven't gotten there yet in the Gospels, it echoes for them what Christ does at the Last Supper. Okay? So remember, when you're reading your Gospel and you read any story about grain or bread or wine, those three things especially, that Christ is trying to tell you something already, both about the Eucharist and about our life as Christians right now, whenever we are reading this. I'm really excited about the next video. I'm going to be talking about the multiplications of the loaves and fishes. And yes, that is plural. There is more than one multiplication. And I'm super excited about this because when you take a minute to look at it, it is so Eucharistic, but that is something that almost all of us miss when we hear it preached in church or when we read it on our own. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Please subscribe to my channel, hit the bell notification. Please share this with someone else so that other people can be a part of this study that we're doing. And most importantly, please pray for me and I'll be praying for you. Peace.